In the summer of 2026, an image spread across social media faster than almost anything in recent memory about ancient Egypt. It was a reconstruction of the Great Sphinx of Giza, generated by an artificial intelligence system, showing what its face may have looked like before 4,500 years of wind, sand, war, and deliberate vandalism stripped it down to the ruin we know today. Within hours, it had millions of views. Archaeologists were tagged, historians were quoted, and a debate that had been simmering quietly in academic journals for over 30 years exploded back into public view overnight. The image itself was striking, but what made it dangerous, in the best sense of that word, was not the picture. It was the questions the picture forced back into the light. Because the moment people looked closely at that reconstructed face, they had to confront something most of them had never been told. The identity of the most famous face in the ancient world has never actually been confirmed. Not once. Not ever. For over a century, museums, textbooks, and tour guides have stated with total confidence that the Great Sphinx depicts the Pharaoh Khafre, ruler of Egypt around 2500 BCE, builder of the second pyramid at Giza. That claim is repeated so often, so uniformly, that almost nobody stops to ask what it is actually built on. What it is built on turns out to be far thinner than anyone expects. The Great Sphinx stretches roughly 240 feet from the tips of its outstretched paws to its tail and rises 66 feet at the crown of its head. It was not built stone by stone. It was carved directly out of the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau, a single continuous mass of rock shaped into the body of a reclining lion with a human head. That fact alone makes it one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements of the ancient world. Its style has been compared to statues from his era. And centuries after it was carved, a stone tablet was placed between its front paws by a much later pharaoh, Thutmose IV, who recorded a dream in which the Sphinx spoke to him and asked to be freed from the sand burying it up to its shoulders. That tablet, now known as the Dream Stele, is the closest thing we have to written testimony connecting the Sphinx to Khafre. And even that connection is damaged. The section of the stele where a name would have been carved has crumbled away. Most Egyptologists have reconstructed the missing text as Khafre based on context and probability. In the late 18th century, the French scholar and traveler Constantin Volney described the face in blunt terms, noting broad features he associated directly with the peoples of Africa, and pointed out what he considered a bitter irony that Europeans could travel across oceans to admire a face carved with African features while enslaving people who shared them. Around the same period, the artist and diplomat Vivant Denon, who accompanied Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, sketched the Sphinx and made similar observations about its features. These were not activists pushing an agenda, they were simply recording an honest first impression, unfiltered by a century of textbook repetition. And what they described does not cleanly match the tidy, simplified version of the face that modern popular accounts present as settled and obvious. The gap between early written observation and later institutional consensus has never been fully closed. It was simply buried under repetition, the same way the Sphinx itself was once buried under sand up to its neck. The most rigorous attempt to close that gap using hard measurement rather than impression came not from an archaeologist, but from a forensic artist. In the early 1990s, a man named Frank Domingo, who spent decades working for the New York Police Department helping detectives identify unknown suspects from partial evidence and eyewitness testimony, applied his professional training to the Sphinx as a personal research project. Domingo did something nobody in Egyptology had rigorously done before. He took the confirmed, undisputed portrait statues of Khafre held in the Cairo Museum, including the famous diorite statue, considered one of the masterworks of Old Kingdom sculpture, and compared their facial proportions directly against the measurable proportions of the Sphinx using the same forensic landmark techniques used in criminal identification. These techniques do not rely on whether a face looks similar. They measure fixed points, defined by underlying bone structure, the distances between them, and the angles they form, producing a kind of geometric signature that should remain consistent if two representations depict the same person. Domingo's conclusion, published and presented at professional forums, was that the proportions did not match in the way you would expect if both faces depicted the same man. The jaw alignment diverged. The facial angle did not correspond. The relationship between the features simply did not replicate the way portrait consistency requires. At the time, this finding was noted, briefly discussed in some circles, and then largely set aside. One forensic professional's careful analysis, however rigorous, was never going to overturn 100 years of settled belief on its own. Domingo's work did not stand alone. A second independent line of evidence came from one of the most credentialed Egyptologists of the 20th century, Rainer Stadelmann, who served for years as director of the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo. Stadelmann raised an anatomical observation that mainstream accounts have never comfortably resolved. He pointed out that the head of the Sphinx looks proportionally too small for the body beneath it. In a monument supposedly carved as one continuous, unified project straight out of the bedrock, that kind of mismatch is difficult to explain away as simple artistic license. Stadelmann's conclusion was that the head may have been reduced and reworked at some point after the body was originally carved, cut down from a larger, different face into the smaller head that survives today. He went further, suggesting the original face may not have belonged to Khafre at all, but possibly to an earlier ruler, potentially even Khufu, Khafre's father and the builder of the Great Pyramid itself. This is not fringe speculation from an outsider. This is a conclusion reached by a senior figure at one of the most respected archaeological institutions on the continent, based on direct physical observation of the stone. And it carries an enormous implication. If the head was reworked after the original carving, then the face we have spent a century debating may not even be the face the monument was originally given. There is a third thread, separate from the facial and proportional debates entirely, that comes from geology rather than art history. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch, working alongside independent researcher John Anthony West, examined the deep enclosure walls surrounding the Sphinx's body, the trench cut into the bedrock that the monument sits within. Schoch identified weathering patterns on those walls that he argued were fundamentally different from the dry, wind-driven erosion that has shaped the Giza Plateau for the past 4,000 years. The pattern he documented was vertical and rounded, the kind of erosion produced by prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall running down a rock face over an extended period, not by blowing sand. Egypt has not experienced sustained rainfall of that kind since long before Khafre's reign, and arguably since before the emergence of the Egyptian state itself. If Schoch's geological reading is correct, even in part, it would place the carving of the Sphinx's body thousands of years earlier than the dynasty credited with building it during a wetter climatic period in North Africa's history. Mainstream Egyptology, led by researchers such as Mark Lehner, has largely rejected Schoch's interpretation, arguing that the weathering can be explained by other mechanisms, including groundwater and later restoration work. The debate between Schoch and his critics has continued for over 3 decades without resolution on either side. It has never been definitively disproven. It has simply been set aside by the weight of institutional consensus, the same way Domingo's forensic findings were. Now place these 3 threads next to each other and consider what they represent together. A face whose measured proportions do not cleanly match the confirmed portraits of the king it is supposedly honoring, according to a professional forensic analyst using standard identification techniques. A head that appears physically undersized and potentially reworked relative to the body beneath it, according to one of the most senior Egyptologists to ever direct research at Giza. And a body sitting within an enclosure, showing erosion patterns that a credentialed geologist has argued for over 30 years cannot be explained by the last 4,500 years of Egyptian climate. None of these are new claims manufactured for internet attention. Every one of them is a real argument made by real credentialed researchers, published and defended over real decades. What the 2026 viral AI reconstruction did was not resolve any of this. What it did was drag all 3 arguments back into public view at the exact same moment, forcing casual viewers to confront questions that professional Egyptology has spent decades quietly managing rather than definitively answering. The story of the Sphinx's missing nose deserves its own correction, because the version most people believe is almost certainly false. The popular account claims that soldiers from Napoleon's Egyptian campaign shot the nose off with cannon fire around 1798 for target practice. That story has spread so widely it is treated as settled fact in casual conversation. But it cannot be true. European travelers were already sketching the Sphinx without its nose decades before Napoleon's army ever set foot in Egypt. Drawings by the Danish explorer Frederick Louis Norden, made in the 1730s, clearly show a sphinx already missing its nose more than 60 years before the French arrived. Whatever damaged that nose happened long before any French cannon reached the Giza Plateau. One of the oldest surviving written explanations comes from a 15th century Egyptian historian named al-Makrizi, who recorded that a Sufi religious figure named Muhammad Saim al-Dar deliberately damaged the face of the Sphinx around 1378 CE. According to the account, local peasants had begun leaving offerings at the monument's feet in hopes of a good harvest, and Saim al-Dar, viewing this as a form of idol worship, defaced the statue in response. He was reportedly later arrested and executed for the act by outraged locals. Whether every detail of that account is precise, it tells us something the Napoleon myth completely erases. People living far closer to the Sphinx in time than we are today already understood it as a face significant enough to provoke deliberate, targeted destruction, centuries before European scholarship ever turned its attention to the monument. It is worth being completely honest about what the viral 2026 reconstruction did and did not accomplish, because that honesty is what separates a genuine mystery from empty sensationalism. The AI-generated image did not uncover new physical evidence. It did not scan a previously unexamined surface of the Sphinx. It did not carbon date anything or extract new data from the stone itself. What generative AI systems like the one behind that image actually do is synthesize an image based on existing inputs, weathered limestone surfaces, historic sketches, early photographs, documented facial proportions, and produce a visualization of what those inputs suggest might be possible. Scholars who examined the image afterward were quick to point out an important distinction. Artificial intelligence can visualize possibilities based on the evidence that already exists. It cannot manufacture new historical facts that were not already present in that evidence. In other words, the image was not proof of anything new. It was a mirror, reflecting back the same unresolved questions that Domingo, Stadelmann, and Schoch had already raised through entirely traditional research, decades before any algorithm ever touched the problem. That distinction matters enormously because it reframes what actually happened in 2026. The Sphinx did not suddenly become more mysterious because a machine generated a picture of it. Its head, according to a leading specialist in Egyptian archaeology, looks physically wrong relative to its body. And its enclosure walls carry erosion patterns that a credentialed geologist has spent 30 years arguing point to a climate that vanished long before the pyramids were built. What changed in 2026 was not the underlying evidence. What changed was visibility. A striking image, generated in seconds and shared instantly across a global audience, did something that decades of academic papers buried in specialist journals never managed to do. It put these questions in front of millions of people who had never been told there was anything to question in the first place. Given everything documented, there are essentially three honest possibilities, and it would be dishonest to pretend the evidence points cleanly toward just one of them. The first possibility is that the traditional attribution is correct in every respect. The face genuinely is Khafre, and every measurable departure identified by Domingo is simply the accumulated result of 45 centuries of weathering, ancient restoration campaigns carried out by later dynasties, and the inherent difficulty of comparing an eroded outdoor monument to a controlled indoor statue. This remains the position held by most mainstream Egyptologists, and it is not without legitimate support. The second possibility is that Stadelmann is right, and the head was reworked at some point after the body's original construction, meaning the face we study today is a secondary carving applied to an older structure, possibly representing a different ruler entirely, with the original face lost beyond recovery. The third possibility, the most contested of the three, is that Schoch's geological reading holds, and the body of the Sphinx substantially predates the 4th dynasty, carved during a wetter period of North African prehistory by a civilization whose identity has not survived in any written record we have yet recovered. This remains the least accepted position within mainstream Egyptology, but after decades of unresolved debate and a viral reconstruction that brought the underlying questions back to global attention, it is no longer a position that can simply be waved away without engagement. What all of this ultimately reveals is not a hidden secret buried in the stone waiting to be sensationally uncovered. It is something more intellectually honest and, in its own way, more unsettling. The confidence with which the Sphinx's identity has been presented to the public for over 100 years was never fully earned by the evidence underneath it. The monument carries no signature. The tablet between its paws does not clearly preserve a name. The measured proportions of the face, according to standard forensic technique, sit at the edge of, or outside, the expected range for a confirmed Khafre portrait. The head appears physically inconsistent with the body it sits on, according to one of the most senior Egyptologists ever to study the site directly. And the enclosure walls may be carrying the fingerprint of a climate that has not existed in Egypt for longer than recorded history stretches back. None of this proves the mainstream account wrong. It proves that the case was never as closed as it has been presented as being. The Sphinx has sat in that same spot on the Giza Plateau for thousands of years, watching the sun rise over the same eastern horizon every single morning regardless of who ruled, who wrote the history books, or what the current generation decided to believe about its face. It watched the Nile shift course over centuries. It watched the surrounding vegetation retreat as the climate dried. It watched Sufi mystics, French scholars, Napoleon soldiers, forensic artists, geologists, and eventually an artificial intelligence system all take their turn trying to explain what they were looking at. Each generation arrived with its own tools and its own confidence, and each generation left behind questions the next one still had to grapple with. The 2026 reconstruction did not end that pattern. It simply became the latest chapter in it, a striking, shareable image that forced a global audience to notice, perhaps for the first time, that the story they had always been told was tidier than the evidence underneath it. What happens next in this story matters as much as what has already happened. Archaeological teams working at Giza continue to document the site, using increasingly precise laser scanning and photogrammetry, building three-dimensional models of the Sphinx's surface accurate to fractions of a millimeter. Every new scan adds another layer to the same archive Domingo worked from decades ago, only far more detailed. If Stadelmann's recutting hypothesis is correct, more precise surface analysis of the transition between the head and the shoulders may eventually reveal tool marks or stylistic breaks consistent with two separate carving campaigns. If Schoch's erosion argument holds any water, quite literally, ongoing climate reconstruction research for prehistoric North Africa could eventually narrow down exactly when the region last experienced rainfall heavy enough to produce the patterns he documented, potentially confirming or ruling out his timeline with far greater precision than was available when he first proposed it in the 1990s. None of these questions require artificial intelligence to answer. They require patient, unglamorous fieldwork, the kind that rarely goes viral, the kind that Domingo, Stadelmann, and Schoch each spent years of their careers quietly pursuing long before any algorithm entered the conversation. It is worth understanding a little more about how forensic facial comparison actually works, because the methodology is what makes Domingo's findings hard to dismiss as mere opinion. Forensic identification is not a subjective art of deciding whether two faces look alike. It is a structured discipline built specifically so that courts and investigators would have a method that did not depend on the personal impression of any single observer. Practitioners identify fixed anatomical landmarks defined by underlying bone structure rather than soft tissue or surface condition, then measure the distances between those landmarks and the angles they form. Two faces sharing a consistent set of these measurements are considered consistent with being the same individual. Two faces whose measurements diverge across multiple landmarks are not. This is precisely why Domingo's background mattered so much. He was not an art historian offering a stylistic opinion. He was a professional who had spent an entire career using these exact measurement techniques to help detectives identify real suspects from partial evidence, and he applied that same rigorous standard to the Sphinx on his own time as an independent research question that genuinely troubled him. The reaction to the 2026 image itself is worth pausing on as well, because it illustrates exactly how these debates tend to play out in public. Some viewers describe the reconstruction as remarkable, a genuinely moving glimpse at a face that had been lost to time. Others, including a number of professional archaeologists who weighed in once the image began circulating widely, were quick to caution that generative artificial intelligence interprets existing evidence. It does not create new historical facts out of nothing. That distinction got lost in most of the sharing and resharing, the way nuance usually does online. But even the researchers most skeptical of treating the image as any kind of proof admitted it had done something unusual. It made ordinary people, most of whom had never questioned the Khafre attribution in their lives, look at the most photographed face in the ancient world and genuinely wonder for the first time whether they actually knew whose face it was. Robert Schoch's geological argument, it is worth noting, did not remain entirely isolated either. British geologist Colin Reeder conducted an independent survey of the Giza Plateau in the late 1990s and reached broadly similar conclusions about the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls, while proposing a somewhat different and generally more conservative timeline than Schoch's original estimate. The fact that a second independent geologist working separately identified comparable weathering anomalies gave Schoch's core observation more staying power within specialist circles than a single researcher's claim typically receives, even as the broader implications remained rejected by most Egyptologists. Mark Lenner, one of the most prominent Egyptologists to study Giza directly, has argued that the weathering could plausibly result from a combination of groundwater seepage, salt crystallization, and later restoration campaigns rather than ancient rainfall, and that argument continues to carry significant weight within the field. What neither side has managed to do, after 3 decades of published back and forth, is definitively close the question for good. There is also a broader historical implication worth sitting with, beyond the narrow question of whose face is carved into that limestone. If the Sphinx's body genuinely does predate the 4th dynasty by any meaningful margin, the entire narrative of how quickly Egyptian civilization organized itself, developed monumental construction techniques, and built the largest stone structures in the ancient world would need serious reconsideration. It would suggest the Giza Plateau was already a site of profound significance long before Khafre's builders arrived, and that his monument may have been positioned deliberately alongside something that already commanded reverence, rather than created in isolation. This would not be unprecedented. Later, Egyptian rulers frequently built on top of or adjacent to earlier sacred sites, specifically to inherit their legitimacy, a pattern visible at temple complexes like Karnak and Abydos, where successive dynasties added new construction directly onto centuries of earlier work. If the 4th dynasty builders reworked an already ancient head into Khafre's likeness, they would simply have been following a very old Egyptian tradition of claiming existing monuments as their own, rather than fabricating something from nothing. None of the 3 researchers at the center of this story, Domingo, Stadelmann, or Schoch, ever claimed to have solved the mystery of the Sphinx outright. Each of them raised a specific, carefully documented anomaly and left it for the field to reckon with. Each of those anomalies has been sitting in the published record for decades, available to anyone willing to read past the tourist placard version of the story. What the viral AI reconstruction of 2026 actually accomplished was not new discovery. It was resurrection, pulling three separate, quietly unresolved academic arguments back into a single, highly visible moment, and asking millions of ordinary people, a question professional Egyptology has never fully answered for itself. Whose face is this, really, and how sure are we, actually, compared to how sure we sound? The honest answer, after Domingo's measurements, after Stadelmann's proportional analysis, after Schoch's decades of geological argument, and after an AI-generated image reignited the entire conversation for a new global audience, remains exactly where it has stood for over 30 years. Inconclusive. Not because nobody has looked closely enough, because everyone who has looked closely enough, using rigorous professional methods rather than repeated assumption, has come away with more questions than the standard textbook account is prepared to admit. The stone has been keeping its own records the entire time, carved into its jawline, its proportions, and the weathering on the walls that enclose it. We simply have to be willing to read those records honestly, rather than deciding in advance what we expect them to say. That willingness, more than any algorithm, is what will eventually determine whether we ever actually learn whose face has been watching the desert horizon for the last 4,500 years.